By the time it happened, the marriage already felt like a house with the heat turned off in winter. Still standing, still technically livable, but cold in a way that settled into your bones and made every room uncomfortable. For months, Laura and I had been orbiting each other like strangers sharing the same address. Conversations were reduced to logistics, groceries, bills, who was picking up what and when. Any attempt I made to talk about us was met with a sigh and eye roll, or silence, so thick it felt deliberate. I kept telling myself this was just a phase, that all marriages go through dry spells, that if I stayed calm and patient it would eventually correct itself. That illusion cracked on a quiet weekday evening. The kind of night that should have been forgettable. I was at the kitchen table answering emails, still in my work clothes, when Lauren walked in like she had already rehearsed what she was about to say. No warmth, no small talk, no easing into it. She poured herself a drink, leaned against the counter, and said she was going to Mexico for a week. 7 days at a resort. Company trip, she added casually, as if she were telling me she'd be late coming home one night. It took a second for the words to register. Mexico. 7 days. Resort. Co-workers. My first reaction wasn't even anger, it was confusion. We hadn't discussed time off. We hadn't discussed money. We hadn't discussed anything remotely close to a vacation. When I asked when this was planned, she shrugged and said it had been in the works for a while. When I asked who exactly was going, she mentioned names I barely recognized. And then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned him. The male colleague I had noticed her texting late at night. The one whose name came up too often, whose joke she repeated with a smile she no longer gave me. I told her it made me uncomfortable. Not accusatory, not yelling, just honest. I said it felt sudden, that it hurt she hadn't talked to me first, that the whole thing crossed a line for me. She didn't argue. She didn't reassure me. She didn't even look conflicted. She looked bored. Then she delivered a sentence that rewired how I saw everything. If you don't like it, file for divorce. No pause. No emotion. No apology. Just a challenge, tossed out like a card on the table. The room went silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I remember staring at her, waiting for something, a smirk, a clarification. Some sign she realized how brutal that sounded. Nothing came. She took a sip of her drink and scrolled through her phone, already mentally gone. In that moment, it became painfully clear that this wasn't about Mexico. It wasn't about a trip or co-workers or even that one guy. It was about how little my feelings factored into her decisions, any more the woman I was married to wasn't asking for trust. She was daring me to object. She wasn't seeking partnership. She was drawing a line and telling me I could either accept it or walk away. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't threaten. I just sat there, feeling something heavy settle in my chest as the last bits of denial drained out of me. The marriage hadn't been slipping by accident. It had been abandoned quietly, one dismissive moment at a time. That evening, with one sentence delivered without hesitation, the illusion that we were still on the same team finally broke. Looking back over the last 6 months, what scares me most isn't that I missed the signs. It's that I saw every single one of them and still tried to explain them away, because admitting the truth felt heavier than carrying the doubt. Lauren started staying late at work several nights a week. Not once in a while, but consistently, to the point where it stopped sounding like overtime and started sounding like a routine she didn't want interrupted. At first, she said deadlines were piling up, then it was team meetings, then spontaneous drinks after work that somehow turned into her walking to the door close to midnight with that distant, overstimulated energy that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She'd set her phone face down the moment she got home, and if a notification buzzed while she was in the room, she'd grab it instantly, her thumbs moving fast, angling the screen away from me like it was instinct rather than intention. The texting never stopped. Not during dinner. Not during movies. Not even when we were supposedly spending time together. And when I asked who she was talking to, she'd give vague answers or say it was just work stuff, even though her expression didn't match the words. There was a lightness in her voice when certain names came up, especially his, a brightness I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. And every time I noticed it, something inside me tightened. Intimacy disappeared quietly without a fight or an explanation, just a steady withdrawal where excuses replaced affection until I stopped asking altogether, because being rejected in silence felt worse than pretending I didn't want it either. Emotionally, she was already gone. Conversations felt one-sided, like I was talking to her rather than with her, and when I tried bring up how disconnected we felt, she brushed it off with irritation, telling me I was reading into things or creating problems that didn't exist. If I said I felt shut out, she accused me of being insecure, of projecting my issues onto her, of trying to control her, instead of trusting her. Even though trust had slowly been replaced by secrecy and deflection, I started to feel like an obstacle in my own home, someone she had to tolerate between her real life and whatever waited for her on the other side of her phone screen. There were moments that should have been small, but stuck with me, like the way she sighed when I asked about her day, or how she put on headphones while sitting 3 feet away from me, or how she'd get visibly annoyed if I tried to plan something for us on a night she hadn't already claimed. I wasn't a priority. I was an inconvenience, a background presence she stepped around rather than a partner she checked in with. Every concern I raised was turned back on me. Every boundary I hinted at was treated like an accusation. And over time, I learned that the fastest way to end a conversation was to express how I felt. By the time she announced that trip, I realized those months weren't isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They were a pattern I'd been refusing to name. The red flags weren't subtle. They were constant, woven into daily life. And ignoring them hadn't preserved the marriage. It had only delayed the moment when I finally had to admit how alone I'd already been. After she said it, after she casually handed me the option of divorce, like it was a menu choice, something in me went completely still, not numb in a dramatic way, but quiet, like the moment after you accept that a door is already closed and there's no point standing in front of it anymore. I didn't argue with her that night. I didn't try to convince her she was being unfair, and I didn't ask for reassurance that clearly wasn't coming, because her words weren't spoken in anger or frustration. They were spoken with certainty, and that made them easy to take at face value. I slept on my side of the bed, barely rested, but with a strange sense of clarity that hadn't been there in months. The next morning, while she was in the shower getting ready for work and humming like nothing had happened, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and looked up divorce attorneys in my area, choosing one based on experience and availability rather than emotion. When I made the call, my voice didn't shake, and when I explained the situation, I didn't dramatize it. I just laid out the facts as they were, because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to protect her image or soften the reality of what was happening. By that afternoon, I was sitting in an office going over details I had never imagined I would need so calmly, learning that the house we lived in was legally mine since I had purchased it years before we got married, that it was solely in my name, that there were no children involved, no shared accounts, no complicated financial entanglements that would drag things out or muddy the process. The lawyer explained it was, by legal standards, a clean case, and hearing that didn't make me happy or sad. It just confirmed what I already felt in my gut, that whatever Laura and I had built emotionally had already been dismantled long before paperwork entered the picture. While she was at work texting and laughing and planning outfits for her resort trip, I was gathering documents, organizing records, and signing initial forms, not out of spite or revenge, but because she had told me exactly where I stood, and I believed her. That week, the contrast between us became impossible to ignore. She packed her suitcase with excitement, talking about pools and drinks, and needing a break, completely unaware or unconcerned with the fact that I had stopped asking questions or reacting to her stories. She assumed my silence meant acceptance, that I had folded the way I always had, and she moved to the house like a guest already halfway gone. Meanwhile, every evening after work, I was reviewing emails from my attorney, double-checking timelines, and preparing for a future that no longer included negotiating for basic respect. There were no dramatic confrontations, no last-ditch emotional speeches, no secret plans fueled by anger, just a quiet strategy built on a reality she had handed me, herself. While she believed she was leaving for a consequence-free vacation, I was making sure that when she came back, the life she had taken for granted would no longer be waiting exactly where she left it. The week she was gone unfolded with an almost unsettling calm, like the air after a storm that never quite arrived. The morning she left, she kissed me on the cheek out of habit rather than affection, rolled her suitcase to the door, and told me she'd text when she landed, which she did, a single message with a plain emoji and nothing else. From that point on, her presence in my life was reduced to carefully angled photos of beaches, cocktails, and sunsets, all sent without context, without asking how I was doing, without acknowledging the space she had created. I didn't respond beyond a brief acknowledgement the first day, and after that, I stopped altogether, not to punish her, but because there was nothing left to say. Each day followed a simple, deliberate rhythm. I went to work, came home, and focused on the house with a level of methodical attention that surprised even me. I packed her belongings room by room, carefully and respectfully, separating clothes by season, placing shoes in boxes, wrapping fragile items in towels so nothing would be damaged. I documented everything, taking photos as I went, making lists, ensuring there would be no confusion or accusations later. There was no anger driving my hands, no urge to rush or break things, just a steady resolve to restore the space to what it had been before it became shared. Her vacation photos kept coming, increasingly carefree, sometimes paired with captions that felt performative, like she was enjoying being seen rather than being present. She never once asked if I was okay, never checked whether the silence meant something was wrong, and that absence of curiosity said more than any argument ever could. I didn't block her, didn't confront her, didn't hint at what was happening, because silence, I realized, was simply the natural result of no longer participating in a one-sided relationship. By the third day, the house felt different, lighter, as if the tension embedded in the walls had started to lift. Her closet was empty, her drawers cleared, her toiletries boxed neatly and labeled. The guest room became a temporary holding space for what remained of her physical presence, stacked carefully and ready to be moved. That same afternoon, I met with my attorney again, finalized the paperwork, and filed the divorce documents, completing the process with the same quiet efficiency that had defined the rest of the week. While she lounged by a pool believing everything at home was exactly as she had left it, the legal reality of our marriage was already unraveling. There were no dramatic messages sent, no last-minute pleas, no emotional explosions to validate any narrative she might have imagined. By the time she finished her third day at the resort, the decision she had challenged me to make was no longer hypothetical, and the life she assumed would pause for her return had already begun moving on without her. She came back on a Sunday afternoon, rolling her suitcase to the front door like she owned the place, sun-kissed and glowing, wearing that relaxed confidence people get when they believe everything at home has been patiently waiting for them. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and immediately started talking, not to me but at me, recounting the resort, the food, the drinks, the weather, how exhausting it was to relax for a full week, all while opening the fridge and helping herself to the meal I had prepped earlier. That day, she didn't notice how quiet the house was, or how little of her was left in it, because she wasn't looking for changes. She was looking for confirmation that nothing had changed. She ate at the counter, scrolling through photos on her phone, laughing at inside jokes I wasn't part of, then finally glanced at me like she had just remembered I existed. She told me the trip had been exactly what she needed and said it with a tone that implied I should be grateful she felt refreshed. A few minutes later, without any build-up, she asked if I had thought about what she said before she left, the words delivered casually, confidently, like she already knew the answer and expected compliance. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't repeat anything she'd said to me that night in the kitchen, because there was no need. I simply stood up, walked over to the table, and gestured toward the envelope waiting there, neatly placed, impossible to miss. At first she looked confused, then mildly annoyed, like this was an unnecessary interruption. She opened it standing up, still chewing, still relaxed, until her eyes started moving faster across the pages and her posture shifted. The confidence drained out of her face in real time. Her shoulders stiffened, her mouth went dry, and the color faded as she flipped through the documents again. Slower now, as if rereading them might change what they said. The room filled with a silence she hadn't anticipated, the kind that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't rush to comfort anyone. She looked up at me with disbelief first, then panic, then something close to fear, as the reality settled in that I hadn't waited, hadn't begged, hadn't needed her to come back to the side. She tried to speak, but stopped, her thoughts clearly scrambling to catch up with a situation she had assumed was under control. The envelope slipped slightly in her hands as she asked what this was supposed to mean, her voice no longer casual, no longer steady. I told her calmly that it meant exactly what she said it would mean, that I had taken her words seriously, and that while she was gone enjoying her vacation, I had made my decision permanent. She stood there, stunned, suddenly aware that the house didn't feel the same, that something fundamental had shifted without her consent, and for the first time since I could remember, she didn't have the upper hand. The challenge she had thrown at me so easily had come back answered, and the shock on her face made it clear she had never believed I would actually accept it. The moment the reality fully landed, she unraveled in stages so fast it was almost dizzying to watch, as if her mind was desperately searching for a version of events where she was still in control. First came denial, sharp and dismissive, her telling me this was ridiculous, that I was overreacting, that people go on work trips all the time and nothing happened, even though she had never once tried to reassure me before. She laughed once, short and hollow, and said I couldn't seriously be ending a marriage over vacation, framing it like a joke that had gone too far. When that didn't work and I didn't engage, the laughter turned into anger, her voice rising as she accused me of blindsiding her, of being dramatic, of making a permanent decision without talking it through, completely ignoring the fact that she had given me that option herself and dared me to take it. She paced the kitchen, waving the papers in her hand, telling me this wasn't fair, that I was punishing her for having a life, that I was trying to control her by walking away instead of fighting. Every sentence twisted the situation just enough to paint her as the one being wronged. Then the tears came, sudden and intense, as if someone had flipped a switch. She cried about how stressed she'd been, how she needed that trip, how I should have trusted her, how marriages require forgiveness and flexibility, all while never actually apologizing for anything she had done. She positioned herself as the victim of my coldness, my silence, my refusal to react the way she expected, insisting that if I truly loved her, I would have waited, I would have fought harder, I would have known she didn't really mean what she said. What finally broke her composure completely was when she noticed the house more closely. The empty closet, the clear drawers, the boxes stacked neatly in the guest room. She asked what all that was, even though the answer was obvious. And when I told her things were packed and that she would need to make arrangements to leave, her expression shifted into pure disbelief. That was the moment entitlement surfaced, raw and unfiltered, as she reminded me that this was her home too, that she lived here, that I couldn't just decide she was done and kick her out. When I calmly told her the house was mine, and always had been, that legally and practically she needed to leave, the restraint she had been barely holding on to snapped. She started shouting, accusing me of humiliating her, of planning this behind her back, of trying to ruin her life, her words overlapping as panic took over. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called her mother, pacing the room while loudly explaining her version of events, casting herself as a betrayed wife being thrown out for no reason, clearly expecting backup validation and pressure to force me to back down. I stood there listening to the chaos she created, realizing how quickly confidence turns into desperation when consequences arrive, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel pulled into the storm she was creating. I had already stepped out of it. Her mother arrived less than 30 minutes later, bursting through the front door without knocking, already angry and already convinced she knew exactly who the villain was supposed to be. She barely looked at me before launching into accusations, telling me I was cruel, impulsive, heartless, that I had no right to ambush her daughter like this after a simple trip, that marriages don't end because of misunderstandings, and that I was throwing everything away over my ego. Lauren stood behind her with crossed arms and red eyes, feeding off the outrage, nodding along like this was proof she had been wronged. I didn't raise my voice or interrupt. I just waited until the noise burned itself out, and then calmly explained reality she clearly hadn't been told. I told her that Lauren had announced she was leaving for a week-long resort trip without discussion, that when I expressed discomfort I was told to file for divorce if I didn't like it, and that I had taken those words seriously. I explained that the house was purchased before the marriage, that it was solely in my name, that there were no children, no shared finances, and that the divorce had already been filed legally and properly. I didn't embellish, didn't attack Lauren's character, didn't speculate about what happened on the trip. I just laid out facts one by one, the way they existed. Her mother tried to interrupt several times, but the longer I spoke, the quieter she got, because facts are harder to argue with than emotions. Lauren attempted to jump in, claiming I was twisting her words, insisting she hadn't meant it that way, saying I knew her well enough to understand she was just stressed, but I didn't engage with that either. I told her calmly that intent didn't matter anymore, that actions and words had consequences, and that this situation was a result of choices, not misunderstandings. When it became clear that emotional pressure wasn't to change anything, Lauren refused to leave, planting herself in the living room and saying I couldn't make her go, that this was her home and I was bluffing. That was the moment I set the final boundary, still without anger, still without insults, telling her plainly that if she did not leave voluntarily, I would call the police and have them escort her out, because legally she had no right to stay in the room when quiet in a way it hadn't before, because for the first time, the consequences were real and unavoidable. Her mother looked at her then, not furious anymore, but tense and calculating, realizing this wasn't a situation she could shout her way out of. Lauren's face collapsed, humiliation replacing rage as she understood there would be witnesses, reports, and an ending she couldn't control if she pushed further. She stormed off to the guest room, grabbed the first few boxes she could carry, and left without another word, fury and shock written all over her face as she walked out a house she had assumed would always be there waiting for her. The door closed behind them, and for the first time since all this began, the silence felt final, not heavy, not tense. Just done. The weeks after she left were messy but predictable, like watching a storm burn itself out after it had already done its damage. At first, Lauren tried to regain control the only way she knew how, by threatening legal action, sending long messages filled with half-formed accusations and claims that she had been treated unfairly, that I had acted in bad faith, that no judge would ever side with me once she told her story. I forwarded everything to my attorney and didn't respond, and that silence seemed to unnerve her more than any argument ever could. When she realized intimidation wasn't working, the tone shifted again. Sharper at first, and then suddenly fragile, as if flipping emotional switches might unlock a different outcome. She started calling late at night, leaving voicemails that bounced between anger and desperation, saying she missed me, saying she couldn't believe I was really doing this, saying we could fix things if I would just talk to her. Somewhere in the middle of those messages came the truth she still hadn't admitted out loud, that the co-worker she had grown so close to wanted nothing to do with the situation once it stopped being fun and consequence-free. The moment the drama became real, the moment lawyers and living arrangements and reputations entered the picture, he disappeared, and she was left standing alone with the wreckage she had dismissed so easily. By then, it didn't move me. The divorce finalized quickly, exactly the way the attorney had predicted. Clean and uncomplicated. Signatures replacing the chaos that had once filled the house. Each document felt less like a loss and more like closure, a quiet confirmation that I hadn't imagined how bad things had become. When it was officially over, there was no rush of triumph or bitterness, just a steady sense of relief that settled into my daily life and stayed there. Months later, I ran into her by chance at a grocery store, one of those moments that used to play out in my head during sleepless nights, imagined confrontations, and unresolved emotions that never quite materialized. She looked tired, smaller somehow, her confidence dulled by realities she couldn't outrun anymore. She noticed me, hesitated, and gave a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes, waiting for something I never offered. I nodded politely and kept walking, and to my own surprise, I felt nothing at all, no anger, no regret, no urge to revisit the past or prove a point. Driving home, I realized that the calm decision I made that night after she challenged me hadn't just ended a marriage. It had ended a version of my life where I accepted disrespect as normal and silence as peace. Walking away without drama, without begging, without trying to be chosen by someone who had already left was the moment I took my life back. And the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was freedom.